The man who was supposed to protect me turned into my worst nightmare. My stepfather beat me because I refused to co-sign his loans. And when I thought my mom would finally defend me, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't act like you're the victim here." What they didn't realize was that I was stronger than both of them combined. And I had the proof that would destroy everything they'd tried to build on my back. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I never thought my life would unravel in the way it did. I had grown used to carrying burdens quietly, believing that if I stayed calm, if I stayed reasonable, the chaos around me would eventually settle. But there are moments in life when someone pushes you so far, crosses such a deep, sacred line, that silence is no longer survival. It becomes surrender. For me, that moment came on an ordinary evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through my bills and saving every dollar I could for my future. My stepfather stormed in, papers clutched in his hand. He didn't ask me, didn't even bother with his usual manipulative charm. He shoved the documents across the table and barked, "You're going to co-sign this loan. Sign it now." I remember looking at the numbers on the page, an enormous sum. The kind of debt that could drown a person for decades. I knew his history. I had watched him spend recklessly, gamble away paychecks, and leave my mother scrambling to cover the holes he dug. And now he wanted me, a young woman just finding her own footing, to shackle myself to his mistakes. I pushed the papers back toward him. My voice was steady, though inside my chest my heart was pounding. "No. I won't do it. I won't destroy my credit for your choices." That single word, no, lit a fire in him I had never seen before. His face twisted with rage. The air seemed to thicken, as though every molecule in the room was vibrating with his fury. And then, before I could react, his hand came down hard across my face. The sting burned hot and sharp, and I stumbled back in shock. I wish I could say I screamed, that I fought back immediately, but the truth is, I froze. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. This wasn't a stranger on the street. This was the man who had married my mother, the man who was supposed to be family. I turned to her, desperate for something, a word, a gesture, a shred of protection. My eyes pleaded with her, "Please, see me. Please, tell him this is wrong." But instead, she sighed, as though she were tired of some childish tantrum. Her words cut me more deeply than his hand ever could. "Don't act like you're the victim here. You know how much pressure he's under. Why can't you just help?" In that moment, I felt a cold, hollow silence settle inside me. My own mother, the person I had always believed would stand in my corner, had not only refused to protect me, she had chosen him over me. That night was the beginning of everything. The violence, the betrayal, the realization that I was on my own. But it was also the spark of something else. A quiet, simmering resolve. I didn't know it yet. But that blow across my face was the last time I would ever let either of them control my future. In order for you to understand just how devastating that night was, I need to take you back to the world I lived in before everything broke apart. The normal I had grown used to. I was in my early 20s then, standing on the fragile edge between dependence and independence. I had a modest job that barely covered my bills, but I was proud of every paycheck. I saved meticulously, skipping dinners out with friends, avoiding impulse purchases. Also, I could inch closer to my dream, leaving home and finally having a place of my own. Freedom wasn't just a goal for me. It was a lifeline. But at home, freedom was something I could only imagine. My mother had remarried when I was still in my teens. At first, I tried to accept it. I wanted to believe this man she brought into our lives would be a partner, a protector. But from the beginning, something about him didn't sit right. My stepfather was the kind of man who always carried himself like the world owed him something. He had an easy charm around strangers, the kind of shallow smile that made people believe he was friendlier, more competent, more successful than he really was. But behind closed doors, the mask slipped. He was impatient, entitled, and when he didn't get his way, he turned mean. He never hit me before that night, but his words carried their own kind of violence. Selfish, ungrateful, too big for your britches. Those were his favorites whenever I refused to hand over money or cover one of his sudden emergencies. He had a talent for making his failures seem like someone else's fault. If he blew through his paycheck at the casino, it was because the economy was bad. If he couldn't pay a bill, it was because someone cheated him. And when he looked at me, responsible, careful me, I think he saw both a resource and a threat. Then there was my mother. I wish I could paint her as an innocent bystander, but the truth is harder to swallow. She wasn't cruel, not in the way he was, but she was willfully blind. She wanted so badly to believe her marriage was solid, that she had finally found stability after years of being a single parent, that she ignored everything else. I would sit at the kitchen table, listening as he spun excuses for his latest blunder, and I'd watch her nod along, her face tight with worry but her words always the same. We just need to support each other. That we never seemed to include him carrying his share of the load. It always meant her bending, me bending, so he could keep stumbling. At first, I told myself it wasn't my place. I was just the daughter, not the head of the household. But over time, the cracks in their world became the walls of mine. Every time he asked me for money, whether it was $20 or $200, I felt the weight of his irresponsibility, pressing against the small boundaries I tried to keep. And every time I said no, I saw the irritation in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was betraying him. Looking back now, I realized those were the warning signs I should have paid more attention to. The way he rifled through mail that wasn't his, the casual questions about my savings account, the jokes about me being his backup plan. Even then, there was something calculating behind his grin. But the real warning, the one that should have screamed the loudest, was my mother's silence. She never once told him to back off, never once told him to respect my boundaries. Her silence became his permission. And so, that was my normal world. Me, quietly saving for a future I desperately wanted, while navigating a house where one man's recklessness and one woman's denial hung over every decision I made. I learned to walk carefully, to avoid confrontations where I could, to keep my head down and my plans private. But as much as I tried to make myself small, it was never enough. My stepfather always wanted more, and sooner or later, I was bound to face the moment when my careful boundaries collided head-on with his greed. And that collision, well, it came faster and harder than I ever could have imagined. The night everything truly began still feels burned into my memory. I had just finished a long shift at work. My body was tired, but there was a kind of peace in going through my routine. Cooking something simple for dinner, sorting through the mail, setting aside bills so I could plan my budget. These little acts gave me control in a house where control often felt impossible. I remember sitting at the table with my papers spread out in neat stacks when I heard the door slam. Heavy footsteps shook the floor, and I knew immediately it was him. My stepfather always made an entrance like the world needed to know he had arrived. He walked into the kitchen with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His face flushed in that way it got when he was either drunk or angry, and sometimes it was both. He didn't bother with greetings. Instead, he tossed the envelope onto the table, scattering my careful piles of bills. "You're going to do this for me," he said flatly. I opened the envelope, my stomach tightening before I even saw what was inside. It was a loan application. The amount nearly made me choke. Tens of thousands of dollars. Enough to bury me before I even had a chance to live. "I'm not signing this," I said immediately, pushing the papers back across the table. I tried to keep my voice steady, but my pulse was hammering. His eyes narrowed. "It's just a signature. You act like I'm asking you for blood." But in a way, he was. Signing that paper would have meant tying myself to every reckless mistake he'd ever made, and everyone he'd make in the future. I had seen him spiral too many times. Paychecks gone in days, late notices piling up, his promises to do better always crumbling within weeks. I wasn't going to let his ruin become mine. "No," I said again, firmer this time. "I won't co-sign for you. I can't." The silence after my words was heavy. His face darkened, the thin line of his mouth tightening until it looked like a slash across his face. Then, faster than I could brace myself, his hand struck me across the cheek. The sound cracked through the room, louder than I thought a single slap could be. Pain bloomed hot and sharp, but it was the shock that left me reeling. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind scrambled to catch up with what had just happened. My stepfather, not some stranger, not some faceless threat, but the man who lived under my roof, had hit me because I refused to destroy my future for him. I turned to my mother, desperate. Surely this was the moment she would step in. Surely she would finally see the truth of the man she had chosen, the danger of the life we were living. But her reaction was worse than the slap. She didn't rush to me. She didn't tell him to stop. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she let out a tired sigh, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Don't act like you're the victim here," she said. "You know how stressed he is. You could at least try to help instead of making things harder." The words hit harder than his hand. I felt something inside me crack, the kind of fracture that doesn't mend easily. I had always believed that, no matter what, my mother would protect me. That belief died in that moment. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I sat in silence, my cheek burning, my hands trembling in my lap. The air around me felt heavier, darker, and I realized I was completely alone. That night was the line being crossed. It was the moment I understood that I couldn't keep tiptoeing around his greed or her denial. Something had shifted, and though I didn't yet know how, I knew this was the beginning of the end of their control over me. After that night, I thought perhaps the violence would shock him into stopping. Maybe, in some twisted way, the shame of what he had done would silence his demands. But I was wrong. My refusal hadn't ended the matter. It had only fueled his determination. The very next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He sat at the breakfast table sipping coffee, flipping through the newspaper, while I nursed the soreness on my cheek. The casual normalcy of it all made me feel like I was going insane. But underneath his calm exterior, something had shifted. He started watching me more closely. Whenever I came home from work, I'd notice him lingering in the hallway, glancing at the papers I carried. If I left my purse unattended, I'd find it moved when I returned. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but then one evening, I walked into my room and found him standing at my desk. rifling through the drawer where I kept my bank statements. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up, unbothered, and smiled like I was the one overreacting. "Just making sure you're not hiding anything. You've got a good income, don't you? Seems only fair that you contribute to the household." My stomach churned. That word, contribute, was his favorite weapon. It made greed sound like duty. It twisted selfishness into family loyalty. The weeks that followed were a slow tightening of the noose. He began spreading little lies about me to extended family. That I was cold. That I didn't care about anyone but myself. That I refused to help my own mother. I knew exactly what he was doing, trying to isolate me, to make me look like the villain before I could ever defend myself. At home, the pressure mounted. He would leave loan applications on the counter, casually reminding me of the opportunities he was missing out on because of my refusal. Once, he even slid one under my bedroom door, scrawling across the top in his thick handwriting, "Be a team player." Every interaction with him felt like walking through a minefield. Some days he was icy, refusing to speak to me at all. Other days, he was overly sweet, dangling false promises of paying me back with interest if I just signed. But beneath every word, every silence, was the same demand: give me what I want. And then there was my mother. I tried talking to her, tried explaining how unsafe I felt, how violated it was to have him snooping through my personal documents. But her responses were always the same. "He's just under pressure. He doesn't mean it like that." Or the one that cut deepest: "You make things worse when you resist." It was like being gaslight in my own home. The walls that were supposed to shelter me had become a trap. I felt smaller and smaller with each passing day, until the very air seemed to belong to him. And yet, despite the fear, a part of me hardened. Each invasion, each manipulation, each careless dismissal from my mother carved a deeper resolve inside me. I didn't know what my breaking point would be, but I knew it was coming. I could feel it, like the low rumble of a storm building on the horizon. What I didn't know then was just how far he would go, or how close I was to discovering the weapon that would turn everything around. Asterisk. The storm I had sensed was coming finally hit, and when it did, it was louder and darker than I'd ever imagined. It happened one evening when I came home late from work. I had stayed behind to finish a project, partly because I needed the overtime, but also because the office was the only place where I felt safe. Walking into the house, I immediately felt the tension. The lights were on, but the air was still, heavy, like a trap waiting to spring. My stepfather was sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out before him. His face was red, not from drink this time, but from barely contained fury. He didn't even let me set down my bag before he barked, "Sit down." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk straight back out the door. But I sat, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap. He shoved the papers toward me. Loan documents again, this time already half filled, my name neatly typed in the co-signer box. My throat went dry as I scanned the pages. It wasn't just a request anymore. He had everything ready. All he needed was my signature. "You're going to sign these," he said. His voice was low, steady, almost calm, and that made it even more terrifying. "You've been living here rent-free, eating our food, letting your mother take care of you. Now it's your turn to give back." The words cut deep. He twisted my sense of responsibility, my desire to be fair, into a weapon against me. But I forced myself to keep breathing, to hold his gaze. "No, I told you before. I'm not tying myself to your debts." For a moment, The room was silent. Then his chair scraped back with a screech that made me flinch. He stood, towering over me, and slammed his fist onto the table. The documents jumped from the impact. "If you don't sign," he hissed, leaning so close I could smell the stale bitterness of his breath. "You'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." My chest tightened. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was a threat, clear and unmistakable. And what broke me wasn't only his words, but the certainty that he meant them. I turned to my mother, who had been standing in the doorway, watching. For a brief second, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. A hesitation that maybe, finally, she might stand up for me. But then she folded her arms, shook her head slightly, and said nothing. The silence was louder than his threats. Something inside me snapped. Not in an explosive way. Not in the way he might have expected. It was quieter than that. A cold clarity washed over me. For the first time, I stopped hoping my mother would choose me. For the first time, I stopped believing there was a version of this story where he backed down. In that moment, I knew two things with absolute certainty. I could not stay silent any longer, and I could not keep waiting for someone else to save me. If I was going to get out of this, if I was going to protect myself, it had to be me, and me alone. That night, lying awake in my bed with the echo of his threat replaying in my mind, I made a vow to myself. The next time he tried to use me, I would be ready. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way. And, as fate would have it, the weapon I needed was already closer than I realized. The morning after that confrontation, I woke up with a strange mixture of fear and determination coursing through me. My cheek was still tender from the earlier slap, and my ears still echoed with his words. "You'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." But beneath the fear was something new, something sharp and steady, a resolve that I was not going to let him ruin me. I knew that if he was desperate enough to physically attack me and threaten me, then he was desperate enough to find other ways to get what he wanted. I had to be vigilant. I began double-checking everything. My wallet, my documents, the drawers where I kept my bank records, and that's when I discovered it. One evening, after work, I went to my desk to balance my checkbook. I pulled out the folder where I kept old bank statements, credit card offers, and any other financial paperwork. As I flipped through the stack, a document caught my eye, one I didn't remember leaving there. It was a loan application, already filled out. My stomach dropped when I saw my name on it. But what made my blood run cold was the signature line at the bottom. It wasn't my handwriting. The signature was a sloppy imitation of mine, close enough that someone might believe it at a glance, but wrong in all the ways I recognized instantly. The loops were too wide. The slant leaned the wrong way. It was a forgery, clear as day. I sat there, frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. My stepfather hadn't just pressured me. He hadn't just threatened me. He had already tried to drag me into his financial mess by faking my consent. Rage surged up in me, hot and bitter. But it wasn't the kind of rage that exploded. No, it was the kind that hardened into resolve. In that moment, I realized I had exactly what I needed. Proof. Over the next few days, I became meticulous. Whenever he ranted or threatened me, I quietly turned on the voice recorder app on my phone, keeping it hidden in my pocket. I took photos of the forged documents. I even started photographing the bruises that still lingered on my skin from that night. Piece by piece, I was building a case. At first, it felt strange, even wrong. A part of me still wrestled with the idea of turning in someone who was technically family. But then I would look at that forged signature, and I'd remind myself, He had already chosen to betray me. He had already crossed the line from manipulation into outright crime. And my mother? Every time I considered confiding in her, I remembered her words. Don't act like you're the victim here. She had made her choice, too. If I wanted justice, if I wanted safety, I would have to claim it myself. Slowly, the fear began to shift. It didn't disappear. I was still careful, still guarded, because I knew what he was capable of. But fear was no longer the only thing I felt. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a flicker of control. I had something he didn't know I had. I had the truth, and I was ready to use it. Once I had the evidence in my hands, the forged signature, the bruises, the recordings of his threats. The fear that had been weighing me down slowly transformed into something sharper. Determination. It was no longer just about surviving him. It was about ending his hold over me once and for all. The first step was research. I spent hours online, reading about identity theft and financial fraud, learning the legal definitions and the proper steps to take. My heart pounded as I clicked through pages about reporting to banks, contacting credit bureaus, filing police reports. Each article I read made it clearer. What he had done wasn't just abusive, it was criminal. The next step was to protect myself. I called my bank and set up extra security on my accounts. I contacted the credit bureaus and placed alerts on my social security number. Each phone call felt like reclaiming a little piece of my life that he had tried to steal. Then came the hardest part, gathering everything and walking into the police station. I remember sitting in the lobby, clutching the manila folder I had filled with documents and photos. My hands were shaking, but not from doubt, from adrenaline, from the weight of finally taking action. When the officer called me back, I laid everything out. I explained the forged signature, the fraudulent applications, the physical assault, the threats. I played the recordings from my phone. I showed the photos of my bruises, the shaky loops of the fake signature compared to my real one. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he looked at me with a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. You did the right thing, he said. This is evidence of fraud and domestic assault. We can move forward with this. Those words were the first validation I'd had in months. For so long, I had been told I was overreacting, that I was selfish, that I wasn't really a victim. And here, finally, someone was telling me the truth. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. What had been done to me was real, and it was wrong. From there, everything moved quickly. The police opened a case, and I was connected with a victim advocate who guided me through filing for a restraining order. I also met with the fraud department at my bank, where I submitted the forged documents. They flagged his attempts and froze the applications tied to my name. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to one of my aunts, my mother's older sister. She had always been kind to me, always suspicious of my stepfather. I told her everything. At first, she was quiet, but when I showed her the documents and played the recordings, her face hardened. You're not alone in this, she said firmly. He won't get away with it. With her support, I felt stronger than ever. It was no longer just me against him. I had allies. I had the law on my side. The final step was waiting for the moment when he would finally realize that his lies, his manipulations, his violence, none of it could save him now. And that moment was coming. Because when the police knocked on our door, with his forged documents in their hands, everything he had built on intimidation and control came crashing down. The day the police showed up is etched into my memory with perfect clarity. It was a Saturday morning. One of those deceptively quiet days where sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything look peaceful. But my heart was pounding because I knew what was about to happen. I had already spoken with the officer handling my case. He told me they'd be coming by to question my stepfather, that the evidence I had provided was strong enough to move forward. When I heard the knock at the door, sharp and authoritative, I knew this was it. My stepfather opened it, wearing that false charm he always used with strangers. "Officers," he said with a practiced smile, "what can I do for you?" But his confidence faltered when they asked to come inside. He tried to keep up the act, cracking jokes, offering coffee, pretending like he had nothing to hide. Then the officer pulled out the papers, the forged loan application with my fake signature, and placed it on the table. I was standing in the corner, my aunt beside me, and I watched as the color drained from his face. For the first time, he looked rattled. His mouth opened, but the words stumbled out in fragments. That's not mine. She must have." He gestured toward me, his finger shaking. The officer cut him off. "Sir, the handwriting analysis already suggests otherwise. And we have additional evidence, including recorded threats." I could almost hear the sound of the walls closing in around him. His shoulders stiffened, his face twisted, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. He slammed his hand on the table and turned on me, his voice raw and furious. "You little liar. You think you can ruin me." But this time, the room didn't belong to him. The officers immediately stepped between us. One of them ordered him to sit down, while the other reminded him that raising his voice and making threats would only make things worse. He sat, but the look he gave me was filled with a mix of rage and disbelief. I think that was the hardest thing for him to accept. Not the police, not the fraud investigation, not even the restraining order I had filed. What shattered him was the realization that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. For months, maybe years, he had fed on my silence, my fear, my hesitation. And now, standing there with the truth in my hands and the law on my side, I was untouchable to him. The officers told him he was under investigation for fraud and identity theft, and that he would also be facing charges for domestic assault. They placed handcuffs on him right there at our kitchen table, the same table where he had shoved papers at me, the same table where he had threatened to ruin me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very place where he thought he had all the power became the place where it was stripped from him. As they led him out the door, he tried one last time to twist the story. "This is a mistake. She's ungrateful. She's lying." His words echoed down the hallway, desperate, hollow. But no one was listening anymore. Not the police, not my aunt, not even me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The days after his arrest felt surreal. The house that once echoed with his heavy footsteps and booming voice was suddenly quiet. But beneath that silence was a storm brewing just for him. Word spread quickly through our extended family and community. People who had once believed his lies, who thought I was selfish or ungrateful, began to hear the truth. My aunt made sure of that. She showed them the forged documents, explained the charges, and reminded everyone of the bruises I had carried. It was like pulling back a curtain. The image he had worked so hard to maintain crumbled in front of everyone. Financially, his downfall was swift and brutal. The bank froze his accounts tied to fraudulent activity. The loans he had tried to take out under my name were not only canceled but flagged, ensuring his record would carry the stain of attempted fraud for years to come. Creditors who had once tolerated his excuses now came after him relentlessly. The gambling debts he had hidden finally caught up, and without new lines of credit to bail him out, he was cornered. The most satisfying part came during his court appearance. I sat quietly in the back, my aunt beside me, as he shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists chained. Gone was the man who strutted through our house demanding respect. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, the forged signature, the recordings of his threats, the testimony of my aunt who had witnessed his behavior. Piece by piece, the case dismantled every excuse he tried to cling to. At one point, he looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes burning with the same rage I had seen so many times before. But this time, there was something else behind it: helplessness. When the judge declared that there was enough evidence to proceed with charges of fraud and assault, I felt a rush of vindication so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. He tried to protest, shouting about how he was being framed, how I had turned everyone against him. But the judge silenced him with a single stern warning. His voice, once the loudest in my life, was reduced to nothing more than a desperate echo in a courtroom where nobody cared. The final, clearest moment of victory came weeks later, when I received official confirmation. He had been convicted. Fraud, identity theft, assault. He was sentenced, barred from opening new lines of credit, and his name was blacklisted with every major bank. The irony was almost poetic. The man who had beaten me for refusing to sign his loans was now untouchable by lenders. The man who tried to steal my future was left drowning in his own debts, with no one left to co-sign or bail him out. As I folded the letter from the court, I felt a deep calm settle over me. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was steady, undeniable, and final. That was the day I knew I had one. After his sentencing, the house changed. The silence that had once felt oppressive now carried a different weight, a peace I hadn't known in years. I could breathe again without bracing for footsteps in the hallway or slammed doors at midnight. For the first time, the air inside those walls didn't belong to him. It belonged to me. I didn't stay long, though. My aunt helped me find a small apartment. Nothing grand, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every bill paid with my own money, reminded me of the independence I had fought so hard to protect. I would sit at the little kitchen table, sipping coffee in the mornings, and marvel at how different the silence felt now. Not suffocating, comforting. My mother reached out, of course. At first, her calls were defensive. She insisted I had exaggerated, that I had made things harder than they needed to be. But over time, her tone shifted. I think reality finally forced her to see what she had been denying. The man she defended so fiercely had not only abused me, he had betrayed her too, dragging her into debts and lies she could no longer ignore. I wish I could tell you that we reconciled immediately, that her realization brought us closer. But the truth is more complicated. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild overnight. I learned to set boundaries with her, boundaries that I had never dared to enforce before. I didn't cut her out entirely, but I stopped allowing her excuses to dictate my life. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into the fragile world she had built around him. As for my stepfather, his downfall only deepened. With his convictions, he couldn't secure steady work. His reputation was ruined. Friends who once gambled with him avoided him now that creditors were circling. He went from swaggering through life, demanding everything, to being left with nothing. The irony was perfect. He had always believed I was his safety net, but when I pulled away, his entire foundation collapsed. Looking back now, I see that the night he raised his hand against me was not just a moment of cruelty. It was a turning point. It forced me to stop waiting for someone else to protect me and to claim that power for myself. It showed me that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most can become the ones who wound us the deepest. And it taught me that protecting myself was not selfish. It was necessary. Today, I live a life free from his shadow. I have my own place, my own career, and most importantly, my own voice. And whenever I doubt myself, I remember that young woman who sat at a kitchen table, facing threats and violence, and still found the courage to say no. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.